It's great to be here, back on Miami Beach. Like Dan said, I used to live across the hall from him. It's one wonderful year of my life. I have a baby now, but I think how nice it'd be to live in that place, to live on the beach with that little kid, you know, while downtown goes crazy around me. So it's great to be here at Art Deco Weekend. This presentation is not really explicitly about anything Art Deco, but given that I published this quarterly periodical of myth, folklore, regional history, I thought I'd share what I think is a very real Art Deco tidbit. Now somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong, I'm in the house of Art Deco. But I have it on good faith that the first Art Deco building within Dade County's boundaries, the greater Miami area, was the Scottish Rite Temple on the Miami River. And what I've come to understand is that the building itself even predated popular use of the term Art Deco. So just an interesting, you know, little amuse-bouche for the presentation here. So I'm talking about Islandia, Islandia, whatever you want to call it. But we'll get to the whole name thing a little bit deeper into the prez here. And so I wanted to tell you briefly what I talk about when I talk about Islandia. Like Dan said, and like I'm telling you, I published this print journal. We have 6 issues so far, 4 more coming this year. The one in the bottom right corner is the most recent one. That top left is the first one we did during the pandemic, as you know, in 2021 version of pandemic. And that's on the bottom right on the cover is a depiction of what we call the Miami Chupacabra. There's an essay in this issue about the work and research of a 1970s, 1980s paranormal researcher from the Miami area who specialized in sort of first-hand accounts of Chupacabra encounters and attacks, you know, in the areas sort of bordering the Everglades and western part of Dade County. So we drew it on the cover there. And just sort of rewinding a little bit, Islandia is very lucky to be a Knight Foundation funded publication. We fund and pay every single writer, contributor, artist. In each issue there are almost 30 individual contributors, writers, artists. I see some here today. And that's thanks to the Knight Foundation and also people purchasing and subscribing to our print journal. Besides that, you might have encountered Islandia on social media. That's where I sort of personally post a lot of archival research and hidden history type stuff about the sort of greater Florida and Caribbean, this region that I'm sort of broadly referring to as Islandia. So I talk about another thing when I talk about Islandia, and that's what this presentation is about today. And that's this right here. This is a brochure for Biscayne National Park. Biscayne National Park was first formed as a monument in the late 60s, but then officially made into a park closer to 1980. So when I talk about Islandia, this is the region of South Florida that I'm referring to, the current day location of Biscayne National Park. Does everybody know where that is? Are we all sort of local? Do I need to do some quick geography? I saw somebody nodding no. Okay, I'll tell you where it is. You see at the very top here, I don't know how long this cord is. Put some slack here, I used to be a rock and roll singer. At the top here is Key Biscayne. So that's the Cape Florida Lighthouse. Okay, so that's, and then this is sort of, I know it's blurry, but this is mainland Miami here. Your kind of Coconut Grove area around here. And Key Biscayne, and then you have this big gap and Biscayne National Park. I mean, it's the biggest underwater park in the country, but the terraneous features of Biscayne National Park, the City of Islandia, right here, is Elliott Key. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about Islandia. It's just good to have that geography in your mind as I tell you all the crazy, I'll do my best not to curse today, crazy stuff people wanted to do here and did here. So I thought I'd also sort of give you a relative scale of the size of the former city of Islandia. That middle stamp is from a document, a 1950s document, which I'll show you some more images of, produced by the Dade County and sort of co-sponsored by property owners in what was then the City of Islandia. It says Elliott Key, 18 miles of waterfront, 18 miles south of Miami. They were very good at marketing. It was very slick stuff, all these catchphrases. Elliott Key from point to point. Now this is one of 33 islands that made up the City of Islandia. If you tried to walk it, which you could, there are parts that are a little more dense than others, but you can walk, and here I'll just show you real quick, I'll go back to this so you have another frame of reference here. You can walk this trail called the Spite Highway from tip to tip. And that's an estimate. It's more than 7.5 miles from tip to tip of Elliott Key. So just to give you sort of that scale, and why I say it was the Miami Beach that wasn't, is because from Joe's to the Fountain Blue is only 4 some odd miles. So, you know, when we think of things that could have been developed in South Florida and the scale to which Miami Beach exists and developed, this story is really one of sort of the surprise that this was never developed despite all the efforts to do so. I'm going to show you real quick. I'm going to go back to the opening slide here. Oh, we're a little off kilter. The Spite Highway that I was talking about, this is an image of it. I'll get a little bit more into that later in the presentation. But it's the sort of artery that runs down the middle of Elliott Key, and that's not naturally occurring, if you can't tell. That's post-Hurricane Andrew, by the way. Okay. So I'm going to take you through a sort of time-space history of the of the people who occupied the space that is now Biscayne National Park that once was Islandia. And I called the early sort of visitors to the Islandia region the map makers, because many of them were 15th and 16th century missionaries who sort of helped us. They came up with all these names for the islands that most of which we don't use anymore. Most of the names that we use for the islands are like British explorers, and they sort of come after and then like into the 20th century, naming by the US government, stuff like that. They come after these first Spanish missionaries. And when the Spanish missionaries first arrived in Biscayne Bay, they arrived at what is now Sands Key, and on maps back then they described it as Restinga de las Tetas. So it's I think that translates directly to like mangrove swamp of Las Tetas, which, I mean, if you don't speak Spanish, I think you can understand what I'm saying. And they called it that because there were these 2 very large, sort of equally sized mounds in the middle of the island that were sort of typical to the indigenous cultures of South Florida, shell mounds and burial mounds that they sort of built up. And so we know for sure that these islands were not permanently ever occupied by the early residents of South Florida. We had the Tequesta and the Calusa who operated down here primarily, and then the Seminoles later in the 19th century, but we know that they used these islands as hunting grounds and as temporary waypoints when they would paddle between South Florida and the Caribbean. So let's see. We have some other early visitors around this 16th, 17th century era. We have pirates, the most famous of which was this mythical fellow, Black Caesar. Black Caesar was one of Blackbeard's crew members, and he eventually, when Blackbeard was captured, Caesar evaded and set up camp in what is today Biscayne National Park and what was then Islandia, on an island that we now call Caesar's Rock, and a creek called Caesar's Creek. They say that, let's see, that's Caesar's Creek right there. They say that Caesar, and that rock in the middle is Caesar's Rock. They say that Caesar would set up on that rock and wait for like unassuming boats to come through this channel, and the currents are very tough in that channel. And they would inevitably run up against the mangroves or something, and that's when he and his crew would raid people. They would take them hostage and hold them on his island and steal all their loot. So we have pirates, we have map makers, and then we also have what I call the pineapple people. So these are the sort of early 19th century, late 19th century, first white American residents of these islands. The islands that make up Islandia are not really great for farming. They're the same bedrock that we have here in South Florida. They're really wet, they're really buggy, but it turned out that you could grow pineapples and then some citrus on these islands. And because the train hadn't yet come to Key West when these people were operating, the primary mode of transporting a lot of fruits between the South Florida area and parts north was by boat. So it didn't really make a huge difference whether you were mainland or an island, for example. You know, this is why Key West was such a dominant fixture in global trade, because, you know, everybody was working by boat anyway. So you had families like the Munroes. Kirk Munroe was this writer and explorer of early Miami history who came and sort of wrote about a lot of these families that were settling. If you see that map there on the far left, those are some of the early settlers of what came to be known as Islandia. These families would own these like 10-acre tracts leading out to the island, and they would come out and use it as a fishing area, but a lot of them set up these pineapple plantations that people from the mainland would come and work, and they would sell them. So with the bringing down of Flagler's train to Key West, it sort of killed that business. There was also a big freeze in the late 19th century that killed a lot of the pineapples. And this is this sort of like flash-in-the-pan industry, the remnants of which, by the way, are still around. I was lucky enough to meet with a fellow by the name of John Nort, whose family owned property on Elliott Key from when he was, you know, before he was born, from early in the 20th century. And he said that on his property there were still these small train tracks that they would use to hand push pineapples from, I'll put in the computer to sleep, damn. Then they would, you know, put all these pineapples, they'd take all these trees, put pineapples in a little push cart and push them out to the coast where the boats would pick them up. And that those train tracks, and even he has a set of train spokes, like wheel spokes, from this industry sitting in his house today. Around this time, the sort of most famous, if you're a historian at all, the most famous residents of the city of Islandia and Elliott Key came to settle. In the middle is a fellow by the name of Israel Lafayette Jones. He was known colloquially as Parson Jones to people of South Florida. He came down from North Carolina after the Civil War and began working for a lot as like a caretaker and a farmer for a lot of the early settlers of Coconut Grove and Key Biscayne area. He worked for Ralph Munroe, you know, probably the most significant settler that he was involved with, and that's how he came to, despite the climate in South Florida, you know, racially at the time, own property on Islandia. He'd been working for a very long time. He met a Bahamian immigrant by the name of Moselle. He'd been working for a very long time. She worked in the hotels in Coconut Grove. They saved up, and it was his dream to own property and just fish and enjoy a peaceful time out on the islands. And it was around this time that they had their two kids, Moselle and Parson Jones, around the time that they acquired property on Elliott Key. And their two kids were named King Arthur Jones, that was the elder, and the one on the left, the most famous resident of Elliott Key history, was Sir Lancelot Jones. And yeah, King Arthur and Sir Lancelot. Sir Lancelot, we'll get back a little bit more to him later, because I'm just kind of taking you through this like time space. Right, now we get a little deeper into the 20th century, and this name might be familiar to some people if you know your beach history, because the Coco Loco K Club was founded by Carl Fisher. It was on Adams Key. None of the remains of the original club stand today. Various hurricanes and fires over the years destroyed the original structures. That's Fisher on the bottom there, and that's Warren G. Harding in the top picture. That same fellow that I mentioned before, John Nort, actually just gave me recently something that he was gifted by. It changed hands, by the way, this club. It was owned by Fisher, who then had to give it to Garwood, the sort of famous boater and speed junkie. And then it ended up in the hands of Bebe Rebozo eventually, who was, you know who that guy is, Nixon's hitman in Miami. And it was Rebozo's daughter, who ended up gifting the Coca Lobo K Club guest book to John Norton. So I've recently been going through, it's pretty moldy, so I'm like sitting there with a mask on, going through it, but it's a ton of fun. And you can see this history from the late 20s, early 30s, of all the different visitors that were there, senators, presidents. There are 4 presidents who would come out here in regular, over time, that would come out here and fish regularly. Nixon himself, Harding, Kennedy, and I'm missing somebody else.
Roosevelt.
It could have been, sure. I'll follow up. So yeah, they would come out here, and it was a private club for the wealthy and powerful of Miami Beach and the city of Miami. There were various places where these meetings would take place, but there was this organization called the Committee of 100 that were all these sort of city fathers, municipal folks, property owners, who would get together and sort of like plan out the city and how they were going to run it and dominate it for the rest of their lives and hand it to their heirs and develop it. And this is one of the places that they would get together. They all like to fish too. So yeah, that ended up in Rebozo's hands. None of the original structures are there today. So we're getting a little deeper into the 20th century. And so interest in this area is really picking up. The population by this time has grown significantly. We did have the 1926 hurricane that sent Miami back big time, but by that time the population had like exponentially grown from, at the early beginning of the 20th century, like 20,000 people to like 200, maybe even 2 million. I think it was like 2 million people were in Miami at the time. So everybody was wanting to get out, buy their piece of Miami, find a place where they could recreate in peace. And this is when Flatbridge Train had already been built. And this was when the first plans to develop a causeway between Key Biscayne and Elliott Key began to appear. Now, that's the tip of Key Biscayne, and those sand flats. I'll just go back to the map real quick so you can see that again. That's the pink is what we're calling the safety valve, and I'll tell you why it's called that. But the pink are those sand flats in that image. So yeah, the pink in that map are these sand flats here. It's 8-mile long, shallow area between Key Biscayne, and that first key is probably one of the ragged keys. There are these 5 small keys before you get to Boca Chica, Sands Key, and then Elliott Key. A lot of keys. Excuse me. These areas are shallow and sandy because when the ocean current travels down the eastern seaboard, it deposits all the sand that it carries down the eastern seaboard into this area. That's why these islands exist in the first place. They're spoil islands. So yeah, there was rock there was coral reef there, but they also accumulated a lot of land as a result. So the more shallow areas accumulated a lot of this sand that was transported down the coast. And so that's why you have these sandy flats. And so when these first plans to develop a causeway between Key Biscayne and Islandia started to rear their head, Ralph Munroe said no. He was thinking primarily about his fellow sort of fishermen and boaters at the time, but also had a sort of eye towards hurricanes and storm surge. So he got together with some local environmental organizations and said, we can't build over this thing. And he was imagining, can you picture the bridge that the old Flagler Railroad was on? You drive down to Key West and you see some of those like arch-looking, trestle, those bridges there. So that's what this would have looked like. There wouldn't have been some, Golden Gate Bridge that just shot over the water, right? It would have been closer to grade than you might think. And so what he said is, if you plug up this area, you're going to turn Biscayne Bay into a wave pool. Because when we get a hurricane and the storm surge comes in, we need a place for that water to escape. And so it traditionally flows back out into the ocean this way. And he said, if you plug that up, we have to be looking at it when I talk. If you plug that up, the waves are just going to bounce back and forth in the bay and everybody's going to drown. And he said that the only way, and this is like a very savvy kind of early branding exercise in environmental protection, and one that I think that, those of us who are interested in protecting the environment can learn from, because I think it does have to be a sleek sort of marketing effort. He gave it a name, and he got together with the government. There's I forget the organization that at the time was like responsible for naming things on the map, and said, we're going to call this the safety valve, and people are going to know that it's an important thing that we have to protect as a result. And so that happened. You go on the map right now and you zoom in on Google Maps to this area, you will see the safety valve right there. But nevertheless, these developers persist. And so we get to the 1950s. And this is, things were a little bit quiet there. We had the Labor Day hurricane. There was a sort of period of like settlers really just recreating and enjoying their property without organizing. But post-World War II, there was this big influx of capital into the South Florida area. People started buying up properties in Islandia. By this time, by the way, there were also some people who had even had, if you go and you click on some of the parcels, I don't know if anybody recreationally goes through the property search like I do, and you click on some of these deeds and you look at some of the images of the records, you'll see that Islandia was subdivided in the 1930s and 1940s in anticipation of speculation on these islands. Elliott Shores was the name of a subdivision that was planned for Islandia. Angler's Retreat was another one. And we're talking, 5,000, 7,500 foot lots with homes on them all along the shoreline. They were going to do it by filling in land, but we'll get to that. 1950s, they're very organized, these property owners, and they get together with the county. As you can see kind of at the bottom there. I've been looking for this document for a while, by the way, and I spent a lot of time at the main branch of the public library, and it was just staring me in the face this whole time. This is a Dade County sponsored effort to explore the possibility of building a bridge over the safety valve. They called it the Key Biscayne and Key Largo Bridge, and they said, we have so many people coming to Miami Beach all the time. Those people have to go back to the mainland. It's not this onerous effort to get to the city of Miami. It takes all of 10 minutes. Maybe back then it took 20, and you're, like Model D, or I don't know. And anyways, you get there, and you're on Miami Beach, and you want to go see Key West. Well, there should be a more scenic way to get there. And on that scenic way, we should probably fill in like 10 islands and build some new ones. And we'll give you like 5 acres back for a park. But we're also going to build like 1,000 houses. And so these are the only renderings of that. These appeared in like a Herald or a Miami News article around this time. You see a map. I'll show you more images from this document. You see a map of what the causeway was supposed to look like, but I haven't really been able to drum up like any sort of architectural renderings of what the causeway was supposed to look like. This gives you enough of an idea. It was going to run from Collins Avenue, go under Government Cut to Fisher Island, and there would be a bridge connecting Fisher Island and Virginia Key, which would then connect you to Key Biscayne, and then you'd drive to the end of Key Biscayne. And in totality, I think it was like 40 or 50 miles. So this is not a short ride. You would have been, by the way, the Ragged Keys span would be the longest bridge in Florida. It would be longer than that 7-mile bridge to Key West. So you see here, that's what they wanted to cover. And I love the great difficulty and pain, but also the great source of joy for me in seeking out archival Islandia material is that it's impossible for me to fit any sort of map or image of Islandia on one page. So this is the first half of the proposed causeway from Key Biscayne to Key Largo. There you have the safety valve. There's proposed island of 800 acres, proposed island of 400 acres, Basque Bridge, the Ragged Keys, and then off to Elliott Key. If you read the document closely, it's hilarious, by the way. They're like, look, we can't say for sure whether or not it's going to affect the tides at all, but we know it's not going to be that bad.
Yeah, we know.
And so it continues on over the rest, some select keys are probably like avoided ones that people who were involved with the county at the time didn't own property on, and continued on to Key Largo. Part of the biggest, actually, I was surprised reading the document that sort of the thrust of the marketing angle was, hey, Key Largo is about the same size as Miami Beach, not that many people own property or live there yet. It can be the Miami Beach, right? And so, yeah, I mean, of course, like, Elliott Key would have been developed and they would have filled in sand, as we know. This beach out here is renourished on the regular, and,
Constantly.
and the same, so to me, it's not sort of ridiculous to think that we wouldn't be trucking sand out to Islandia either. So it's sort of easy for us to imagine. And so they get super organized, right? This proposal comes out and it comes to 1961 and they're like, okay, the way we're gonna do this is we're gonna become a municipality and we're gonna lobby and we're gonna use our power to make this a reality. And then we're gonna sell the shit out of it.
That's right.
This is the Islandia, Florida City Hall, nowhere near Islandia. They had 3 locations of their city hall, the first of which was in an office building owned by the fella who's sitting underneath his own photograph. A sort of legendary, nefarious figure in Miami history by the name of Luther Brooks. I don't know if you know your mainland history very well. Luther Brooks. Luther Brooks was the biggest landlord and property manager in what we now know as Overtown, and was then referred to as Colored Town, and Brownsville, and parts north, Liberty City. He was the guy. If you read A World More Concrete by Dade County, which is like one of the great histories of the Miami area, you'll learn a lot about Luther Brooks and his practices. So he sort of is like, hey, I'm done being a slumlord and a total thug. I'm gonna go be a developer. So he buys some property on Elliott Key. This is like his retirement plan to like continue dominating, Florida society. They have all their meetings on the mainland. Nobody ever really lives out there full time, by the way, except for Lancelot Jones, whose family still owns property in there. There's Lancelot Jones and then some sort of caretakers who are there on a more permanent basis. These guys would come out on the weekends, go fishing, set up their camp, have a good time, and leave. So they have City Hall. That office building was on Northwest 7th Avenue and like 49th Street. They had Islandia City Hall was next in the DuPont building in downtown, the present day location of the Aston Martin condo or something. And then the final location of the Islandia City Hall was in an office building on US 1 near Dadeland, which is now a Trader Joe's.
That's okay.
Yeah, so here they are. And it wasn't until 1962, after they'd officially become a city, and they were the 27th city to be incorporated into Miami-Dade County. And I guess on a day like today, kind of, you can see they're wearing jackets and all that, that they held their first official council election on the island. They all took votes over there. A barge brought that voting machine over. Some people arrived by helicopter, and they voted. That's, by the way, that's also a piece in what would become the Greater Spike Highway behind them. Life was good. Hey, we're making a city. We're gonna get the causeway. And so people would sort of go up and down these makeshift roads on the island on this this microbus called the Islandia Express. There were regular ferry rides operated. They left from the southern part of the county around like South Dade, what is Princeton, Goulds, like 168th and Old Color. I'm saying all these addresses like people can like immediately imagine them and are like as southern part of Dade County, because if you see where Islandia is, right? Elliott Key, if you go directly west from Elliott Key, you're closer to Homestead than Miami. So the ferries would leave from there. That fella in the safari cap there is named Fred Beland. He was a Miami developer and one of the major boosters of the Islandia project. And I mean, probably the driving force, besides Luther Brooks, who sort of used his muscle to get them into the places they needed to be, Fred was a major personality in trying to get Islandia developed. Now, I'm sort of, it's not that I'm mischaracterizing them, I'm making them into sort of cartoonish versions of themselves, because a lot of these people, you know, loved the environment and were there because they loved to recreate in the environment. You don't just go, you know, set up and camp on a mosquito-infested island because you hate the environment. Like, you endure that because you like being out there in the peace and all that. But at the same time, and this was sort of the great sort of dialectic of you know, 20th century American life, is they wanted to build some shit. And so it wasn't always, they had this newsletter before they formed the city. Yeah, and I found these newsletters in the Munroe collection at the University of Miami's archives. And you can see in 3 back-to-back issues of their newsletter just how they'd conceived of this place. Right? It goes from the Elliott Key News, accomplish first things first. That's kind of aggressive for an island vibe. And then they're like, okay, we're gonna name this place, so this issue is a fun one, it's the No Name City News. And then we have the winner, the Islandia News. And I thought it'd be fun to show you some, you can kind of peruse this list of names that weren't. Now ultimately, by the way, the story of Islandia is a story of failure. I mean, you know, sort of getting to the end before the beginning here. Nothing was ever built here. So I like to wonder if one of these other names might have worked better for them. And for me, it was always like, it's kind of a bland one. I mean, some of these names are hilarious, by the way. You know, Shangri-La. Yeah, I don't know. You can just go through here. I find something new each time. Nixonville. Yeah, it's like Ben Bozo is like, hey, let's call it Nixonville. Which one do you think would be like the winner? Like, okay, if it was called that, they would have gotten anything approved they wanted.
Riviera Keys.
Which one? The Riviera Keys, yeah.
Keys.
I think you're on the right track with Keys. I think it had to be called a Keys something.
I think Frustrated Island.
Frustrated, is that what?
A dead ringer.
Gold Coast Keys, that's another one.
Yeah.
Port Smathers, ooh.
Yeah, that's terrible. I think that if they had gone with either Miami Islands or Miami Keys and sort of relied on the institutional Miami name, that they might have had more success. I mean, we have the Florida Keys. Why wouldn't people want the Miami Keys? Say, hey, I'm going out this weekend to the Keys, the Miami Keys. Anyways, I'm going to sell you some stuff later. And so this is, by the way, how you pronounce the name, according to these fellas. That is pronounced Islandia, not Islandia. To keep yourself fully informed, please do this. I should tell you, by the way, that I say Islandia. I use the Spanish pronunciation because it gives me a giggle each time. You know, if you say Islandia, that's actually the Spanish way of saying the country of Iceland. And I like to think of Miami as a sort of Iceland because the sea levels are rising thanks to glacial melting. But it's a beautiful day. So here's just some other maps that came up around that time. On the far left is the official map of Islandia, Florida. These are all the keys that made up the city. The city of 33 islands. All the marketing material that you see coming out around this time says that. That's the big catchphrase, city of 33 islands. It's sort of the most solid concrete map. And around this time too, they've by the mid-60s, they've learned and they're starting to get wind of an environmental movement happening in the United States. The sort of collective consciousness of the country is coming together and saying, hey, we're sort of destroying this place and we need to preserve that which is beautiful. And if you've ever been out to these places, to the islands, or just put on a snorkel mask, I mean, we have, hundreds and thousands of acres of coral reef that are still sort of savable if we do something about it. So the movement's starting to pick up, and they're like, okay, we're not going to get the bridge over the safety valve, so let's just start proposing these other ideas, right? There's a car ferry to Sands Key, and then we'll bridge down from Sands Key to the Key Largo area. But around this time too, Islandia makes the big mistake that sort of ended up screwing themselves over in the end. Is Islandia tied their fates and became associated with another very large development on the mainland called Dade. There was another one that ended up getting built around this time, which if you purchase issue number 7 of Islandia Journal, you should know about. It was called the Aerojet property. So Aerojet, Dade, and Islandia were 3 projects that were coming out in the middle 1960s, early 1960s, middle 1960s in South Florida. Aerojet was an aerospace and rocket research facility in the Everglades that still exists to this day. It's an abandoned facility. There's a silo that used to be able to climb down into, but they covered it with concrete. And by the way, with a rocket and rocket fuel. And they dug this canal called the Aerojet Canal because they were testing rockets that they were going to transport from Aerojet out along the water and up to Cape Canaveral. So we had Aerojet and Dade, which is the one I just mentioned. Let me see. Do I have a map of Dade? Yeah, here. So this is a little blurry. Let's see what I'm looking at here. This was like another proposal. Okay, there's Dade property. Dade was at the current location of Turkey Point. Dade was an industrial port and oil refinery owned by a guy named Daniel Ludwig, who's this Midwestern industrialist, banker, and it was thousands of acres. And he had snuck this proposal in through the county docket, and it was pretty close to getting approved, but it required that they dig a channel so that large ships could access. So, you know, the waters around these areas are not super deep, so they wanted to be able to dig parts of a channel that would pass through Islandia, but they also wanted a causeway to go along with it that would connect Dade and Islandia. And Islandia was like, yes, look at all this industry and development, like, we're gonna be able to use South Dade finally. But that was where people started to draw the line, because you're talking now about an industrial port and oil refinery, which sounds a little edgier than just houses. And so this was a clip, Polly Redford, who I think wrote a big book about Miami Beach, right? $1 billion sandbar. Wrote an article around the time that was published in Harper's that was sort of making an appeal. There's the environmental movement and groups from other parts of the country. You had Earth First was down here. A lot of groups from other parts of the country were defending this area. Like, it became a battle. And so it became a battle in the publications. And I'll just read this because it's kind of beautiful. And so you get a sense of what it's like to be on these islands if you haven't been out to Elliott Key or anything like that. So she wrote, the 33 rocky islets that everyone wanted to dredge, fill, bulldoze, and develop held the last vestiges of Florida's once splendid tropical forests. Back in the woods, no one had bothered to cut were now rare. Mahogany, Vitae, milk bark, Jamaican dogwood, 7-year apple, and fish poison vines. Species of ferns and palms thought to be exist still remain in crannies where botanists had only recently found them. These woods were host and shelter to thousands of tropical and migratory birds flying to and from the Caribbean. No one knows exactly what birds, for no bird count had ever been made. And so that's sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. The plan to turn this area into Biscayne National Monument picked up full steam. Started with the Nixon administration and Secretary of the Interior by the name of Stuart Udall. Congressman Dante Fascell made this pitch on behalf of the area and said, I'm a fisherman, I use this place. It's the most beautiful place, the main attraction physically of this area. The reason we all live down here is because of this natural beauty. And he brought Udall down here, and Udall, I actually found these clips, I wasn't able to get them in the presentation. There's a clip in the Wilson archives of Udall getting on a plane and flying around Islandia, and he sees it. And within months, the proposal is fast-tracked to turn this area into Biscayne National Monument. These guys get pissed, and they decide they're going to proceed like nothing is happening anyway. And they say, well, if we're going to have if we're going to develop this, because we're going to develop this, we need a road down the middle of the island. And so they illegally brought tractors and bulldozers out to Elliott Key and cut what is now known as the Spite Highway. It's the main walking trail of Elliott Key. And so, I mean, that first image is a little bit more apocalyptic because it was immediately after a hurricane, so all these trees have lost their, leaves and stuff like that. It's like all these like dead trees, like, Spite Highway. But this is what it looked like for a long time. There's another look at the Spite Highway there. So you get a sense of the scale. Remember, this highway would be as long, as if you were driving to North Beach, right? So driving from Ocean Drive, right, tip South Point to North Beach. That's how long this highway was. But they were in the 80s, came around, right, and Islandia was being made into this national park. There was just like this one last-ditch effort. This fellow by the name of Jack Pims became the mayor of Islandia. He was a property owner on the mainland. He owned the building that became the Trader Joe's where Islandia City Hall was. And he formed this Ragged Keys Yacht Club. So he owned like 3 of the Ragged Keys. He was the mayor of Islandia. And he said, look, I'm not trying to develop anything yet, but I do want people to be able to come over here and use it on a recreational basis. I don't want it to be private. So I'm forming this yacht club. It's kind of a cute logo down there. That houseboat was the headquarters of the Ragged Keys Yacht Club. It was a houseboat that was decommissioned after being used in the Republican National Convention when it came to Miami Beach, and they towed it out there, and that was just where they hung out. Apparently, if you look at Google Earth at the top of Ragged Keys number 5, and you zoom in right next to the island in this location, imagine this is the southern part of the island. Now, I hope that you'll go home and do this today. This boat sunk in its place. I know this from the current. The Ragged Key is actually, this Ragged Key number 5 is one of 2 privately owned islands within the national park. So I was able to contact the current property owner. I was actually able to speak with Jack Pims, who's in his 90s. He lives in Denver. He moved, after his attempt to develop Islandia failed, he moved out to Colorado. Now the reason that it failed was not just because people just didn't want Islandia to be developed, but because Pims himself was going through some financial troubles. He had to give these properties back to a bank. It was more like a short sale, so actually it wasn't back to the bank, but he had to sell them off in order to stave off other lenders. Pims leaves South Florida, sort of penniless, shows up in Colorado, and within a year wins the state lottery for $5 million. And so I spoke to him, he had retired after that, so it's just this sort of like strange, ironic twist of fate. So yes, Pims and the previous owner said that if you look at Google Earth maps and you zoom in on the location of that houseboat right there, you can see like the gunwales, right? You can see the 2 sides of the boat sitting there now. I mean, I'm not going to get on Google Earth and zoom in right now, but you should. It's there. Trust me. He tried really hard, right? It was called, he called it another Stiltsville. He wanted to build, I think it says there, as many as 5,000 could eventually be built. And Pims insisted this to this day, by the way, when I spoke with him a couple years ago that he got a raw deal, that the land is so shallow around the Ragged Keys that it's useless. Well, useless is a very sort of loaded word. But eventually it sort of got tapered down. 145 houses on stilts would be this Stiltsville type development. But none of it worked. It ultimately ended up being a failure. And so what we got instead was Biscayne National Monument, like I told you, formed in 1967 or 1968, which stayed as a national monument until officially being made into a national park in 1980. And so this, I just thought this was a fun image of floating information center. It sort of gives you a feel for what Biscayne National Park is, right? You have these Elliott Key and 33 islands of uplands, but Biscayne National Park is notable because it is mostly underwater and explored that way. That's what we have today, friends. I should say, by the way, before anybody asks any questions, I do have like 10 copies of 3 issues of the Islandia Journal on my person. So if anybody wants to check them out or buy one, I would love that. Like, it's a nonprofit. It's in person a day, I'll give you a great deal, $10 each.
Okay.
We normally sell them for $15 on our website. Yes.
I mean, this was amazing, but I'd really like to learn more. Is a lot of this covered in the?
Well, the journal, actually, the journal is other people's work primarily. So it's a literary type magazine where we have a lot of hidden histories and essays and stuff like that, but it's a lot of poetry and fiction and visual art as well. So it's like a literary arts magazine. Like I said, you will find hidden histories, but this specific history is, I give this presentation, and it may appear in some printed form at some point.
But is it on the website then?
There are tidbits here and there. We have a digital library on our website that's a bunch of like documents. It's a little bit, it's visual, right? So you'll have to sort of click through if you want to find any of it.
Well, these maps were fascinating.
Yeah. There are a lot of them are in archives too. If you ever have time to go check them out at UM or at History Miami or at the main branch of the library.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, just want to say a great way to learn the history is to go to Biscayne National Park. The outfitter there has great tours, including one where they take you kayaking or paddleboarding in Jones Lagoon, named after that family, and they give you the history of the Jones family. You learn about and when you mentioned that was the only island that was inhabited, or the only family. It wasn't necessarily part of Islandia. When a little south of there, I spent the night at a house on Linderman Key, which is before Key Largo, and I know it was developed, I think, before World War II because they used to spot submarines out there.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
So this is common around World War II, that there were Nazi submarines around the area and stuff like that. Yeah, and by the way, I should mention, because you mentioned Jones Lagoon and brought him back up, so that was the tip of the iceberg of Lancelot Jones. I could give a whole presentation about that guy and his family and their history alone, but it's important for me to do a sort of bigger survey of development and stuff like that. But,
well, he was like the mayor of Islandia.
yeah, presidents would come down and he would guide them around, and he lived there. He almost lived there until his death, but then Hurricane Andrew. I was friendly with a park ranger who was actually a contributor. He wrote a short essay that's in one of the issues I had with me. Gary Brennan was his name. He was a park ranger for 30 years in Biscayne National Park, and I joke with him that he's maybe the only person besides people who were affiliated at the time who really knows more about that area than I do. So anytime I talk with him, I'm turning into a little kid. But Gary just retired, but he was friendly with Lancelot Jones and tells a story about having to come and evacuate him for Hurricane Andrew because he didn't want to leave. He said, I've been through hurricanes before, and all the rangers came out on a boat and they were like, dude, this one's different. And so, and his home was blown away, and he lived out the rest of his life on the mainland. Yes?
Around 40 years ago, I worked with a member of the Vick family. In your research about the ownership of Elliott Keys, you run across that name. She claimed that her family owned it and decided it wasn't worth much, so they sold it and farmed potatoes in South Dade.
There's Vickers? Well, anyway, I know the name hasn't come up, so I'm going to look it up. Thank you for that hot tip. I love it. I'll look them up. But if you stay in touch, and by the way, if you all want to come up after, I don't have a sign-up sheet, but if you want to give me your email or something, you'll see a lot of. I do talks like this, but then I'm happy to see Christina, who helps lay out the journal and has been with me since day one. We do events throughout town, and we're always kind of getting updates about the issues of the journal. And particularly, by the way, if you're on Instagram or on social media, that's where I post a lot of internet history, and that's where I do my best keeping in touch with people who are interested in the journal. I know not everybody's on there, so I try and do my best to email as well. But follow us at Islandia Journal or give me your email address. I'd love to stay in touch and let you know what I find about the Vick family. Yes?
It's so interesting. This is history that's 60 years old, and so many of the people who were part of it are just passing away. Very neat that you got in touch with that developer who went to Colorado. In your work on this, have you heard from maybe the sons and daughters and the grandchildren of people who were involved in the big push
Yeah, so the reason that I was able to meet Jack Pinge, or speak with him on the phone, you know, he's out in Colorado, is I was familiar, there's a Suchman family that owns properties up and down US, retail sort of properties up and down US 1. And so by degrees of separation, I got in touch with them. Because I knew that Pims, if you look up Pims in the archives, you find that he was a partner with the Suchman family. Right, so it's they had a company called Pim Suchman. And so I said, hey, does anybody know how I can contact Jack Pims? And then John Nork, who I mentioned a couple times in the presentation, his mother was actually the resident historian of the City of Islandia. And he grew up going there, and he just happened to come to one of my presentations. And I recognized him because I looked him up when I see him in the crowd, and I'm like, oh shit, I better get everything right this time. But besides the two of them, I've tried to track a couple people down, like Fred Beland's kids. I think one of them's a realtor in Key West, and I tried reaching out, always trying, because to me, as somebody who practices archival research and and sort of journalistic approaches to these things, those are the best resources. Those are the people who knew the people, and so I rely heavily on archives and records when I can't contact people. Thanks, yeah, that's a good question. All right. Okay, thank you so much.